Now, in New Zealand, a few weeks ago, Labour's capital gains tax policy was leaked, and it made it clear that if they get into power, multiple property owners would be targeted with higher rates of taxation in the future. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in New York City recently, Zoran Mamdani, who wants rent freezes, price controls, and city-owned grocery stores, became mayor. Socialism is seeing a resurgence in the West as more people, typically younger and without significant assets behind them, struggle with a rising cost of living. The world's brokenness is pretty obvious, and equality and taxation is a really thorny issue that I really rather not talk about. But as investors building wealth for a better tomorrow, you, or more specifically, your wealth, becomes the solution eventually. So we need to talk about this. Now, I've paid over six figures every year in tax for well over a decade. I can afford to cover my family's health requirements outside of state assistance, but I still like knowing that I'm paying a share in the costs of making New Zealand a better place and a safer place, ideally, as well. Is New Zealand becoming a better, safer place to live in, though? I don't know. And I'm concerned that paying even more tax going forward isn't really the solution. And if you think so also, or at least you want to see the other side, then this one's for you. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Darcy Angaro. I am a qualified financial advisor and the host of the NZ Everyday Investor podcast. On this channel, I help everyday Kiwis figure out how to build new wealth for the new world that we're heading into, which increasingly appears to be a world of bigger government. If you value this type of content, please like and subscribe, and please share your thoughts towards the end of the show. Let's get started. Now, when it comes to investment returns, there are three big things that will eat away at your gains over time: fees, inflation, and taxes. And here's the weird part about the whole thing. The smallest one, fees, well, that usually gets all the attention. The middle one, inflation, well, that's almost always misunderstood. And the biggest one by far is taxation. But that's the part that's clouded by political bias and, let's be honest, also the occasional misinformation campaign from our very own politicians. So in this video, we're going to be jumping into three hard truths about tax, control, and inequality. Now, for full disclosure, I am biased. We are all biased, of course, but I'm going to say it. And I am biased towards personal responsibility over bigger government. But I do acknowledge that our tax system needs to change because our world, including our financial system, is going through change right now. It's going through a digital transformation. So at the end of this one today, I just want to leave you with a question that might make you and me a little bit uncomfortable, yes, but it's something that we all need to find an answer for. How much tax is too much tax? And who really benefits from this higher rate of taxation? There are 3 points to consider when trying to answer this. The first point is this: government is not a charity, but that's often how it's framed. Now, there are some people who believe that paying tax is the same thing as being generous. So if you're trying to avoid paying tax, you're being stingy, greedy, and not generous by default. Now, these people really want those who have a lot, especially, to be even more generous than they are. Now, in my view, tax shouldn't be conflated with actually giving to charity because government is not a charity. Now, for background, my wife and I have been donating to actual charities with people at the heart of them for over 25 years. And for the first time ever last year, it was a goal of mine, and last year we finally did it. We gave more away in donations than we did in taxes. Now, we started giving long before we actually had any money to spare, partly because we believe that the more that we give, the more that we receive. And I can tell you by experience, it's true. Now, today, it sounds a little bit out of place to talk like this, but organizations like Hospice New Zealand, which needs $94 million annually from the community because the government funding doesn't cover their services, and other mental health organizations and food banks, well, the reason why they can do all their things is partly because Kiwis fund them, and they fund them beyond the amount that they're paying in tax. Now, a great example of this is actually Robert Laidlaw, the founder of the Farmers Trading Company. From 1910 onwards, barely 1 year after founding his company, he committed to donating not just 1%, 5%, or 10%, but 50% of his personal earnings to charity. Now, that's pretty full on, right? But hey, if the remaining 50% is more than enough to take care of things, why not? You're a long time dead. Individuals, churches, businesses, but not government entities and bureaucrats, funnily enough, deliver faster and more effective outcomes to the most vulnerable people in society. When politicians pat themselves on the back, therefore, for initiatives that lift up the poor and vulnerable in our country, I think we need to remember while government is full of terrific and well meaning individuals, it is a very large beast of an organization, relatively speaking, and they have many competing interests that often don't include making the most from minimal input. And it's simply just not possible for them to be efficient at what they do. So, if government is not a charity, that means your tax, certainly not a donation for the poor and needy and vulnerable in society. Tax is the mandatory contribution that citizens pay to fund public goods and services that the free market forces cannot reliably provide. So that brings us to point number two. It's more of a question, I guess, rather than a point. Is tax really about collecting revenue to fund public goods and services? I think no. Tax is also about control. And at the very least, it's about influencing behaviors. So, yeah, we need to raise money for all this so called good stuff that we're doing as a government and some stuff that no one else is going to do, for sure. But it's also about making us do different things, incentivizing us and disincentivizing us. Government funds its activities in two ways. Firstly, by taxation, and secondly, through inflation or through borrowing, more accurately. Income is taxed up to 39%. And when we spend our money, what's left, we're spending 15% of that in GST, in goods and services tax. We also then pay council rates. That's a property tax if we own a property. And the bigger your property, even if you're not getting more services, the more tax you pay. We also pay a fuel tax or a road user charge. In New Zealand, most of our tax, and I'm being simplistic here, actually comes from income and spending activity, and not when the value of what we own increases, or that's called capital gains. Inflation is this stealth tax, though, that no one really talks about. And quite often, a lot of the inflation occurs when government borrows more without a corresponding boost in economic output. And how this works? Treasury issues bonds and the Reserve Bank buys them. The government then spends that money, which has literally been created out of thin air, but it's a lever that inflates asset prices and reduces how much you can afford to buy with your money over time. Now, Labor's proposed capital gain tax would tax capital gains on property, apart from the family home, of course, but they're framing it as making the rich pay their fair share. Perhaps then a capital gains tax is not what should happen, according to you, or according to a lot of people, but it is what will happen, in my view. And these are some of the likely side effects. Firstly, there'll be less private investment in rental properties. There's less incentive. If you're going to lose 25% of your gain on the sale of that property, why would you want to bother providing a long-term accommodation service to those who can't or those who won't afford to buy a home on their own? Property is a less liquid form of wealth, remember. It can't be converted to cash easily. And without a tax-free capital gain as a bit of an incentive, other investments start to look a lot more attractive by comparison. And none of this changes the fact, of course, that people still need to live somewhere, right? All that happens then is that the government will end up paying a larger role and become a larger landlord. And if they're not as efficient as private individuals and charities with helping the poor, are they really going to be more efficient than private landlords? Of course not. What's going to happen? Well, rents will increase. And who pays rent the most? Well, those who can't afford to own property, which are those that are most likely affected by the stealth tax of inflation as well. So, does it really help the poor? I don't think so. On the bright side, though, assuming the rich don't all pack a sad and pack their bags as well and leave, they may decide to reallocate their wealth into non-property investments. And I see this as probably a pretty good thing, right? Maybe the New Zealand share market gets a boost from all this new tax on property gains, dissuading people putting money there and putting more money in markets. And maybe more capital finds its way into startups so that we can own the best and the brightest companies here in New Zealand for longer rather than losing them offshore. So, in a way, maybe a capital gains tax might change behavior in a positive way that increases our productivity as a nation. I actually think that a lot of property investors might even be on board with this new type of tax. And no, funnily enough, it's not because of the free GP visits that they're going to get. They'll be on board with it if it's packaged up as part of an overall tax renovation where there's a reduction in other taxes that they, or more specifically, their tenants have to pay. In other words, if a capital gains tax came with a corresponding reduction to income tax rates, well, I think landlords in some cases would actually be on board with it. Investors like certainty as well, and ripping that capital gains band-aid off goes down pretty well, I think, here. I just think that there needs to be that overhaul, though, in the broader tax system. That's all. And ultimately, New Zealand is a small economy, so a more simplified tax system is pretty wise, especially considering workers already pay more in combined taxes than most developed nations in the world. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. So, tax is inevitable, death and taxes. Yep, it has to happen. Has to pay for those things that need to get done that we're not going to voluntarily do on our own. But let's just not forget it's also about control. If you're on the left of the spectrum, you might want more government control, especially your type of government. Maybe not so much if you're on the right, though. Regardless, I don't think your politics actually matters because of this last point. Inequality is hardwired into the system. If we really want to know how much tax is too much tax for the everyday Kiwi, we need to appreciate that an unequal distribution of resources, of opportunities, and outcomes exist not because the rich are getting richer, but because of how the money works. Now, I've been a citizen of New Zealand, originally from Canada, for almost 30 years now. So, in many ways, I've already adopted the culture and the mindset of many of the locals, of many of the people who sound more Kiwi than I do. So I don't mean to speak down on Kiwi culture here, but if a 30-year-old Kiwi can, then surely I can. Here's the deal. We really do have an issue here in New Zealand with envy, aka the tall poppy syndrome. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that we have a scarcity mindset. Rather than pursuing abundance and doing so with open collaboration with others, we shrink back in the belief that opportunities and success are limited. And this is why when we get something, our instincts tell us to hoard it. Some of this goes pretty deep, I know, but in a way, it is actually really simple as well. In the pursuit of infinite money, we develop finite, scarcity based thinking. Let me drive it home like this. The New Zealand dollar has lost almost 25% of its value over the last 5 years. Unless you're growing your stash of cash faster, you're going further behind. Now, of course, that was an anomaly in the last 5 years, but I need to point out again that the consumer price index does not accurately capture the real rate of inflation as we age. I also need to point out that the rates of inflation are inevitably going to be higher in the future because of what the world is going through in terms of a digital transformation. Now, in my view, it's only when we pursue finite money do we really create infinite outcomes in this type of world. But let's consider this thing called the fiat financial system, where money is created into existence by government decree. In 1971, something interesting happened. The US president at the time, Richard Nixon, severed historical ties between the dollar and this finite resource called gold. And given the interconnectedness of all currencies to the US dollar, from 1971 onwards, all currency around the globe was effectively backed by nothing scarce anymore. Governments and banks have been able to create new money out of thin air, with some limitations, of course, ever since. And I can't leave out one of the very best quotes that a New Zealand central banker has ever said here. Adrian Orr, the former Reserve Bank governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, said, "It's a great business to be in, central banking. You print money and the people believe it." With hubris like that, who needs enemies? But our currency comes into existence in the form of principal, and that principal appears in our bank account when a lender issues a loan. But the issue is principal and interest is due over time. So in other words, more and more money needs to be created over time in the system to avoid a lack of money in the process of debt repayment. Hopefully that makes sense. The result, though, is simple. Anything that's used to secure loans or anything that can be bought with loans, like property and like shares, soar in price relative to the rate at which your income will rise. Asset owners get wealthier, but not because they're greedy. They get wealthier because they understand how it works and they're simply just taking advantage of it. Meanwhile, those who believed in the value of studying hard to get a good wage and a good job, they end up chasing something that loses value every year. And let's not forget those who are sick or who are unable to increase their income in some way. What little they can afford becomes less and less affordable every year. No wonder they're angry. Is it reasonable then to expect those without assets to just stand back and watch the fortunate sons appear to strive ahead effortlessly each year without complaining? No, of course they're going to complain. They're angry and they just don't know who to blame. And New Zealand's tax system doesn't help. So is that it? Do we just sit back and take it and let them tax more and more every year? No, I don't think so, because there is a point where it does become too much tax. And I think the answer as to when we reach that point lies in between the struggle between extreme ideologies of collectivism and individualism. Now, collectivism views taxes as a shared duty to fund collective welfare, while individualism, extreme individualism, sees tax as an infringement on personal earnings and autonomy. Collectivists don't appreciate just how inefficient it is to rely on government for solutions. And individualists don't realize that charity is actually part of true wealth. We all need to pay our fair share of tax. Yes, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but we need to support charitable activity too, so that we have justification for smaller government. Government should do more for less. It's that simple. And they should do that before they ask more from the people. Maybe technology is a solution as well. I think when not only the most wealthy, but the most productive and charitable people stop threatening to move and they actually start packing their bags and moving, well, that's enough tax. Do we really want to go there? Hopefully not. Are we there yet? It's debatable. Let me know, though, what you think in the comments. That's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll catch you in the next one.